Eugene Kontorovich is a professor at George Mason's Antonin Scalia School of Law and the director of its Center for International Law in the Middle East. Before coming to George Mason, he had been a professor at Northwestern University School of Law for 11 years. An expert in international and constitutional law, he has published over 30 academic articles in the leading law reviews and peer-reviewed journals. His scholarship has been cited in leading international law cases in the US and abroad. Professor Kontorovich is also the idea, sorry, I must have gotten that wrong, of the International Law Department, must be the head director, at the Kohelet Policy Forum, a Jerusalem-based think tank, and is recognized as one of the world's preeminent experts on international law and the Arab-Israeli conflict. He has, quote, emerged as a one-man legal lawfare brain trust for the Jewish state, unquote, according to Haaretz. Professor Kontorovich also plays a leading role in many Israel-related policy matters and is regarded as the intellectual architect of U.S. state laws regarding boycotts of Israel. There are seats up here, sorry. In his work at Forum Kohelet, he regularly advises senior Israeli, U.S., and European officials. His expertise is often sought out and quoted by all the major news organizations, including the New York Times, to the Wall Street Journal, CNN, Fox News, BBC, and NPR. He has been honored with a fellowship at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and with the Federalist Society's prestigious Bader Award, given annually to a scholar under 40 for outstanding scholarship and teaching. Professor Kontorovich attended the University of Chicago for college and law school and taught there for 2 years as a visiting professor afterwards. After law school, he clerked for Judge Richard Posner on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. In his previous career, he was a newspaperman at the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, and for many years at the Forward. It is my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Eugene Kontorovich.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming here tonight. Thank you for taking time to listen. Thank you so much to Rabbi Scheiner for helping us arrange this. And thank you to the Gross Family Center for sponsoring this event. Yeah. Our theme tonight is modern blood libels. Modern blood libels. And we need to know what is a blood libel before we talk about the kind of blood libels with which Jews are confronted today. Blood libels, historically, were a kind of claim, often made in the Middle Ages, that Jews used Christian babies' blood to make matzahs. Now, most distinctively, the claim of a blood libel is a claim of incitement to incite hatred and ultimately violence against Jews. I think you want me to use the mic. Mic? Yes. Okay. It's okay. That's right.
I'll put it together.
No, it's in. Just on. Yeah. Better? Everyone needs to be up. Hold on. Better? Okay, here we go. Okay, thank you. The claim of the blood libel is a claim that was used to incite violence and pogroms against the Jews. But let's look at certain characteristics of the blood libel claim to see what made it even more distinctive. The claim of a blood libel is particularly notable in its outrageousness. Not just that it's false, but that it's almost impossibly false. That it's like science fiction. You don't have to come here in a few months, in 5 months, to take the rabbi's preparing for Pesach class to know that the use of blood in matzah preparation is completely not kosher. Like, it's the most impossible. It's like, if you had to think of the most unlikely thing for Jews to do, it would be to use blood in anything, in matzah in particular. Okay, so it's a lie that is so big that it's not just not the truth, it's like the opposite of the truth. And that kind of big lie, as Goebbels would later understand, the more outrageous the lie, the harder it is to respond to. And a lie that does not intersect anywhere with the truth is almost impossible to refute. So a claim that is not just not the truth, but has no points of intersection with it. That's one thing. And another part of the sociology, I think, of a blood libel is that it's a big lie, the opposite of the truth, and that resonates particularly with the taboos and sensitivities of the surrounding culture. So in Christian culture, the notion of blood being used for matzah, because blood and matzah are connected in Christian symbolism to Easter, which falls around the same time, it was like the worst thing that one can think of, right? Obviously killing children anytime, the worst thing one can think of, with references to Christian religious beliefs that made it impious as well as murderous. So it's the worst, in other words, it's the worst kind of thing you could accuse someone of. So today, no one is going to accuse Jews of using blood and matzah. It's not so connected to any cultural sensitivities. But there are other claims now that have emerged which are similar in structure. Similar in structure. The goal is to incite hatred and violence against Jews, today gathered principally in the Jewish state, that are not just not true, but that are the opposite of the truth, that are a parody of the truth, an inversion, and that are designed to harness contemporary cultural sensitivities in a way to further incite and further be outrageous. And unfortunately, so you'll see in the title of the lecture today, in the past several months, in the past 6 months, we've seen really an explosion of these kind of claims aimed at the Jewish state, almost an avalanche. Claims that are typically framed in legal terms, but that are designed to incite hatred and yet are completely untrue. We're going to address 3 such examples today. One is the claim that was made starting about December of last year, at the height of the COVID pandemic, that Israel was improperly withholding or blocking or denying access to COVID vaccines to the Palestinians in a way that was a breach of certain Israeli obligations. This is really the shape of a classic blood libel, which have often been closely related to Jews as the agents of disease, vectors of disease, or responsible for the disease, spread of disease in non-Jewish communities. So that's almost exactly the shape of a classic blood libel. Another one, more recent, that Israel is responsible for a horrible crime, the crime of apartheid, perpetuated against Palestinians and Israeli Arabs. And a third blood libel, a third false accusation, that Israel is evicting Palestinians from their properties in Jerusalem and taking over Palestinian homes, private homes in Jerusalem. These claims are very difficult to address because, again, they're so made up that it's very hard sometimes to even know where to start. So we're just going to start. We're going to start one by one, and we'll start with the vaccines. I think it's important to note, and this is why it's something that I work with and something I deal with. These claims are very typically put today, not in religious terminology, but in legal terminology, in often the terminology of international law, that Israel is somehow violating international law. I think there's also a deeper reason for this that I might mention. I'm an international lawyer, I don't need to know the deeper reason, I'm just going to talk about the international law, but it might be sociologically interesting to think why. So today, in a largely post-religious, postmodern society, the notion of unifying rules that come from a higher source has been eroded. So to say that Jews are rebelling against God or against some divine revelation is no longer a claim that really excites people. But today there's still a sense that there must be some kind of top-level authority. And for many people of a cosmopolitan persuasion, international law sounds like a set of rules that is higher, that is general, but that is not divine in nature. Now, the nature of international law we don't have time for, but there's not the idea that the power of a claim that Israel is violating international law is that it's a claim that there's these general rules that apply. Not our rules, not rules we made up, not rules any country made up, but like the laws of mankind. Okay, so let's talk about vaccines. A claim became very popular about 6 months ago. It began with a few fringe NGOs and was eventually echoed in the halls of Congress, in the halls of the British Parliament, in the halls of the European Parliament, that Israel is breaching its obligation to the Palestinians to provide Palestinians with COVID vaccine. And the claim was that Israel is obligated under international law, in other words, the higher law. Israel is obligated under international law to provide Palestinians with free COVID vaccines. In fact, there not only is no such obligation in international law, but the relevant international legal instruments, if anything, say the opposite. So, first of all, Israel and the Palestinians signed the Oslo Accords in 1993. And in 1995, they signed a supplemental document spelling out the details of the Oslo Accords in great detail. And that document has a specific provision called public health that addresses who is responsible for the public health of the Palestinians. And under the Oslo Accords, for which a few people won Nobel Prizes, so it was taken as a pretty serious international thing, it says the Palestinians have exclusive responsibility for the public health of the Palestinian population. And of course, immunization is just a subset of public health. Now, more importantly, it actually says that Israel surrenders, gives over to the Palestinians all the powers over public health, which doesn't just mean that it's a Palestinian obligation, but that Israel doesn't have the power, doesn't have the right, does not have any ability to interfere in the public health of the Palestinians, because providing for people's health is not just an obligation, it's also part of governing them, right? There's different ways to provide for people's health, different policy choices you need to make, which vaccine and so forth. This is left entirely to the discretion of the Palestinians because they have their own form of self-government. Now, people who didn't disagree, who wanted to bypass this claim said, forget about the Oslo Accords, they don't count, they don't matter, except when they only count when they obligate Israel to do something to the Palestinians, but when they don't, they don't count. Instead, this is occupied Palestinian territory, and under the laws of occupation, Israel is obligated to provide vaccines. So again, this is an argument that's very hard to address, because first of all, it is not the case that Israel is occupying the Palestinians, and so it's not a situation of occupation. But even if it were a situation of occupation, even the most cursory look at the relevant international conventions make quite clear that there would be no obligation to vaccinate. For example, the Fourth Geneva Convention, Article 56, deals in particular with hygiene and public health, what an occupied power is supposed to do to deal with public health in an occupied area. So assume in a counterfactual situation, Israel were occupying the Palestinians. The explanatory note to the Article 56, sort of spelling out what it means, says the task of providing for public health is above all one for the competent services of the occupied country itself. In other words, even if Palestine were the occupied country, the task of providing for public health would be up to them. Interestingly, it goes on to, there's another provision of the Geneva Conventions, not cited in relation, but it's useful to know. Article 6 of the Geneva Convention specifies the rest of the provisions of the Geneva Convention, in particular the provisions of public health, stop applying 1 year after the close of hostilities. That means that even if Israel ever was, even if it still is occupying the Palestinian territory, the provisions dealing with vaccines and public health would have ceased to be relevant in May 1968. That's exactly in the same treaty that people are talking about. Now, needless to say, that part of the treaty is entirely uncontroversial. There's no room for interpretation. It's 1 year. It's a number, not an idea. Was not cited in any of the discussions by any of the junior legislators in Washington and in any of the public debate. In other words, the question of vaccines as a breach of some kind of obligation, something Israel owed the Palestinians, was injected purely because it was December, it was January. What was the hot button issue in the world? COVID vaccines, right? This was, and the characteristic of the bloodline was to take the most sensitive issue of the time. Now, interestingly, in another provision of the Geneva Conventions, it says if there's a country that's occupied and its medical services have collapsed and it doesn't have any hospitals, it can't run its own job, in that first year, the occupying power does have to step in and provide vaccines, and they can take over, basically. They can impose public health measures coercively on the population. So in the view that Israel would have an obligation to vaccinate, it would also have a power to impose quarantine on the Palestinians, charge them for the vaccines, and no country pays as much as Israel. That's why they got them so early. No one wanted to pay as much as Israel. Charge them for the vaccines, like take it out of their money, and forcibly vaccinate them if possible. Nobody thinks Israel should do that because no one actually believes that this provision applies. The idea was trotted out simply to accuse Israel of something that would resonate very powerfully and emotionally. Okay, so the vaccines is an example of a fairly narrow issue. Then at the same time, we're seeing an accusation that's much bigger, I think is going to last much longer. The accusation that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid against the Palestinian population. This accusation is much broader in its scope, and thus even more greatly untrue, and thus at the same time harder to refute. Because how do you refute something that so broad in the contours of its falsehood? So first of all, let's just say a few words about the crime of apartheid. Crime of apartheid was defined by an international legal treaty in the 1970s, the Convention Against Apartheid. And it was a convention designed to say that what South Africa was doing was a crime against humanity, a crime under international law. And it defined apartheid as systematic acts of inhumane conduct, such as murder, enslavement, forcible labor. Those are the main ones. On a large scale murder, enslavement, and forcible labor, designed with the purpose of subjugating one racial group under another. Now, by the way, that kind of stuff actually happens a fair amount in the world, and they didn't mean to say that like all of what China or Iran is doing is illegal. So they actually made it narrower. They said on a scale similar to South Africa. Right? And South Africa is the test case. Indeed, the reason it's called the crime of apartheid, as opposed to just the crime of doing bad things, is to really define it very specifically around the South African case. Okay, so that's the crime of apartheid. Since South Africa, how many countries has the international community or any international court identified as committing the crime of apartheid? The answer is 0. Now, that is not to say that the practice of some countries might not match the description of apartheid. But because the legal definition specifically says of a form similar to South Africa, in fact, the standards are very high, because South Africa was unusual in the openness and explicitness of its system of laws. Right? That is to say, it wasn't something hidden, it wasn't something covert, it wasn't something that they had another name for, it was something they were fairly open and proud about. Now, what was the central feature of the apartheid system? As the name says, the apartness. Apartheid was a system of systematic separation of races in all areas of public life, and ultimately, geographically, with the black population moved into particular districts and areas. And in a series of laws, blacks and whites were separated in every form of public facility. So, now let's apply it to Israel. In what public facility are Arabs and Jews separated? Not a single one. There simply is no facility in Israel, from the public drinking fountain to the Supreme Court bench, in which Jews and Arabs are not together. And this is the same inside Israel proper. And it's also the same in Judea and Samaria, in the Green Line. You can drive to the mall in Gush Etzion, and there are cafes there, and the cafes owned by Jews typically, and they're open to Jews, and they're open to Arabs. So there's simply no system of apartness, and needless to say, nor of murder, nor of enslavement. So I mean, and because no country has been defined as an apartheid state, it's very hard to know what apartheid would look like. But let me give you maybe an example of what might rise to the level of apartheid. I don't want to say for sure because there's no precedent. But let's say you had a regime. So Human Rights Watch just wrote a 270-something page report accusing Israel of apartheid. So consider the following set of facts. What if you have a country, maybe this would be apartheid, what if you have a country that does not allow the disfavored racial or ethnic group to have property rights, to buy land, does not allow them, bans them from property ownership? And what if you have that same country also has a system of education and a system of public propaganda that sends messages of violence and inferiority against that group? And what if, going further to murder, that same country actually has a public program, a government program, of paying people to murder members of the disfavored group? You would have all policies of the Palestinian Authority, which punishes the sale of land to Jews by death or life at hard labor, depending on the time period, which has curricula, which a recently European Union funded report, which they decided not to publish but has been leaked, says full of anti-Semitic and insightful materials, and which pays people for acts of terror on a sliding scale correlated with the numbers of victims. The worse the crime, the more you get paid. So that might seem like policies that might begin to approach the level of apartheid. Right? They have the aspect of apartness. Right? That is why Jews cannot live anywhere under Palestinian control, whereas Palestinians can live under areas of Israeli control. The message of dominance and the element of murder. We're beginning to... None of those policies are mentioned even once in the 271-page Human Rights Watch report about apartheid and the Palestinians. This is what I mean by an inversion, right? They're looking at this territory to find apartheid, and it's right there. Right? It's not hiding. The Martyrs program, these payments, is a public program. It is not a secret, it's not a covert program. Instead, they say Israel is guilty of apartheid. So the claim is so marvelously false. But then, so the question is, why make such a false claim? Right? If I do involved in some things with government, trying to convince people of things, I would always advise a politician to try to say something smaller that's less easy to refute. Why not just say something that's harder to refute, like to say Israel's doing some things that are bad, or some policies to the Palestinians that we disagree with, that we would do otherwise. Because apartheid, with its very clear racial connotations, happens to resonate with one of the most sensitive issues of our times, right? The issue of racial justice. And thus, you pick the accusation which is in the idiom of the dominant value of what would be seen as being most taboo by society. So we've moved on from matzah and questions of religious ritual, which used to be very evocative. Right? The Last Supper was a Passover Seder, so it was very evocative to people. So now it's not. So we pick the hot button issues of the day, exactly in the way of a blood libel. And of course, there's the other feature of a blood libel. It's one thing to say. So, for example, America is, today. It turns out America today is accused of systemic racism, systemic police execution of blacks, and it's taken as a criticism, but not taken as a basis for the abolishment of the state. But apartheid is a very unique crime, because there's been one apartheid regime, right, that we're familiar with, South Africa, and the remedy was not get them to do some things differently, right? The remedy was not to repeal the Black Homelands Act of 1970, right? Not like we're going to do some rearranging of the deck chairs. When it's that systemic, the remedy is the end of the regime. And that's what calling Israel an apartheid state is code for. That we've moved beyond criticism to saying this is a regime that really needs to be replaced in its entirety. Now, interestingly, Human Rights Watch has written reports where they have said that some Chinese government policies are apartheid-like in nature, but they've never said that the Chinese Communist Party regime is a apartheid regime in whole, though obviously it involves the subordination of many ethnicities, such as the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, and many more. Okay, so that is apartheid. Then there is the question of land theft, evictions. This is a very, again, strange issue. I started being asked by some foreign diplomats, maybe also around February, said, can you explain to us what's going on with these Palestinians being kicked out of their homes? And I said, I don't know what you're talking about, what Palestinians? And then they kept asking, and I thought, do they really mean this Sheikh Jarrah case? They can't mean the Sheikh Jarrah case. It's like nothing. It's not a big deal. But indeed, that's what they were talking about. So the Sheikh Jarrah, why did I not think it was a big deal? This is a 40-year ongoing court battle between some Israeli property owners and the world's most tenacious holdover tenants who have not paid rent in over 50 years, which is a really long time. So what's the story with these properties? The story is pretty simple. The properties, everyone agrees, belonged to a series of Jewish organizations before 1948. They were purchased by Jewish communal organizations, rabbis, in the 19th century, and were owned by Jewish groups and Jewish people until 1848. They're located right outside of the Old City in an area the Arabs call Sheikh Jarrah, that is also the home of the tomb of Shimon HaTzadik, a Jewish religious site. So there's a group of houses there. In 1948, during the War of Independence, that area fell under Jordanian control. And the Jordanians, with all the areas that fell under their control, kicked out every single Jew. A complete ethnic cleansing. Not a single Jew remained. So in Israel, you have an 80% Jewish minority, 20% Arab minority. Jordan, said one Jew would be too many. They kicked every single Jew out. Then there was Jewish property, and different things happened with different parts of the Jewish property. Some of the Jewish property, the Jordanians simply seized and transferred the title to people who they wanted to give it to. They just gave it, they re-gave it. It wasn't theirs, but they gave it away. And other property they took control of, but they never got around to giving it away. They used it for different purposes. They let people stay there. So in that latter set of properties, people started living after 1948, but they did not have title to it, certainly under Israeli law, but also not under Jordanian law. When Israel retook these territories in 1967, they made a very interesting decision. They decided to respect the titles of Palestinians who had been given land by Jordanians that previously belonged to Jews. And it makes a certain amount of sense, because it's not their fault, right? They were just living there, and they weren't the government, and the king wants to give them free land that belongs to other people. They never expected the Jews to come back, so why not? Makes a lot of sense. Because this is a big problem with absentee property after a war. If you think the status quo is going to go on forever, if you don't reassign title, then you're going to have vacant properties and general blight and neglect. And Israel did exactly the same thing with Palestinian property of Palestinians who were absentee, who had left the territory. Because if you think the status quo is going to go on forever, you can't leave it ownerless. But the Jordanians did leave some subset of property ownerless. Sheikh Jarrah involves 7 cases involving a few plots of property that the Jordanians had left ownerless, had not transferred. So in 1967, the Jewish owners say, well, this property we have a claim to. But Israel still, and this is why I say the blood libel is the opposite of the truth, under Israeli law, they still say that even if the Palestinians do not have Jordanian title, they will still be treated as protected tenants under Israeli law. In other words, they're allowed to stay as tenants. You can't evict them as you would be able to evict normal tenants. But they're tenants. Everyone with me? They're not tenants that you agreed to, but they're tenants you have to keep. So these cases went to court. The Palestinians made property claims, and in a series of court cases that went on for decades, Israeli courts rejected all the Palestinian property claims, which they don't always do. They sometimes recognize them when they have validity, but in this case they said they were invalid, and they said you can stay, you're tenants, just pay rent, not market rent, like a protected tenant rent. Now the tenants have refused to pay rent for, as I mentioned, since 1967, and have done other things inconsistent with being protected tenants, like making changes to the properties, and other things you would not want your tenants to do. So after 40 years of this, what happened? Nothing yet, actually. But eventually, after 40 years, it was getting to the stage where maybe even the property owners would get an eviction order, which they do not have. No one's actually been evicted in this situation. And this set off an international furor that Israel was kicking Palestinians out of their homes. No part of this is true. Not their property. Israel's not really doing the kicking. These are both private property disputes that are decided like any other private property dispute. And by the way, the same law applies between Jews and Jews, and the same law applies between Arabs and Arabs. Arabs also bring property claims against other Arabs in East Jerusalem and seek eviction. And here's the amazing thing. Israeli courts have ordered Arabs evicted from property without any complaint countless times when the plaintiff is an Arab. Happens all the time. I have a friend who works in the Jerusalem prosecutor's office. This is all she deals with. So what's the only problem in this case? Why is there an international scandal? Same law, same rules, because the plaintiffs are Jewish. If no one disputes that if the people seeking rent or eviction here were not Jews, there would not be an international scandal. In other words, the claim here is that Israel is doing something terrible by not maintaining the Judenrein status quo established by the Jordanian ethnic cleansing of 1967. So, people trying to regain their own property and not being allowed to do so for 50 years because of their ethnicity has been turned into Jews are kicking Palestinians out of their houses. It's like an inversion. So it's not good that we see all these broad libels today. I think going forward, probably the apartheid one is going to be doing most of the work because it's the broadest and most ambitious. And again, it's used fundamentally to call into question the entire validity of the state.